blind review. And Seven Sage and PowerScore have written some terrific articles on blind review. So I got to thinking, if 2 reviews of a prep test are good, can I distinguish myself further by suggesting 3 reviews? Is there any sort of pedagogical value to that? And what I stumbled on was that actually there is. You still have questions unanswered after 2 reviews. And it really requires a 3rd review of the material until you've sort of figured out what to do about some of the mistakes that you made in the 1st and 2nd review through the material. So what I'd like to do today is teach you this method. When I started working with Jake, by the way, the reason that I brought him into this is that we discovered that we were basically teaching very similar strategies. And to me, this is a real verification that I was on the right track, because Jake is somebody who knows a lot about the psychology of learning, and he has a lot of experience teaching. And so that corroborated for me that all of the things I had been doing and that I had experienced that were working with my students, there was actually some learning science behind it. And there were reasons why this was working. It wasn't a gimmick. Okay, so let's go ahead and start talking about the triple review strategy. Next slide, please. All right, one of the reasons that I came up with this strategy is that many of the students who were coming to me.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
All right, sorry. One of the reasons I came up with this is that many of the students who were coming to me for tutoring were making one of 2 big mistakes. Some of them would tell me, I've taken 20 prep tests and I haven't gotten any better. And then when I ask them, well, what else have you done? They've done little else. Maybe they've reviewed some wrong answers, or thought about some explanations to some questions, but not a whole lot of robust substantive review. And then I have this whole other entire camp of students that comes to me and says, I've read PowerScore, I've done 7 Sage, I've watched 100 hours of videos, and I still have no idea what I'm doing. And I think to myself, well, you've never actually gotten in the trenches and executed the skills that you've been reading about. And so it's no wonder that you haven't really improved your skills. And so obviously we need some combination of these strategies in order to push our students forward and to help them get better at timed scores. You want to jump in, Jake?
Yeah, first of all, hi, everybody. I'm Jake. I'd like to reiterate what Keith is saying with regard to sort of the confluence of our experiences here. As Keith said, I come at this world of LSAT from the standardized testing world, and the idea of review of test material is something I've been doing for ages with the SAT, the ACT, the GRE, the GMAT, as well as the LSAT, and it. The efficacy of doing so is confirmed by all of this experience I see with people who, like Keith said, will do test after test after test after test, looking for that affirmation that they are good at the test through some score that they want to see on the other side, rather than seeing the process of taking practice tests as an opportunity to learn. There's a theory about assessments, about tests. There are 2 ways to look at it. One is an assessment of your learning, and the other one is an assessment for your learning. And we should be using our practice tests as an opportunity to determine where our gaps in understanding are, so that we can take it forward to the next opportunity. So like Keith was saying, there are these people that take too many tests, and for me, that gets encapsulated by the cram school method, right? People that go off for their entire weekend, spend 12 hours in a room with somebody dictating drill after drill after drill after drill, and there's no opportunity to breathe. There's no opportunity to let things settle. There's no opportunity to be considerate about what you've done and what you intend to do in the future. You're just overwhelmed. You're saturated with information. And with regard to the strategy books, I've experienced exactly the same thing. I've gone to 5 different tutors. I've read 10 different books. I've seen all of these different videos, and I don't get anything that's going on. And that's because they're waiting for somebody else to tell them the perfect thing, rather than adopting, putting on the hat of being your own teacher, your own instructor, and saying that there's plenty of information in the world, but how am I supposed to how am I supposed to digest it all? And what am I supposed to do with it once I have it? And until we understand our job as student is not just to receive the information, but to process the information and to turn it into something usable, we're not actually giving ourselves the best chance at growing. So in that way, I've reached these same conclusions that Keith has through his work as professor and as teacher and as tutor and as writer, and me coming from my experience. And so it, like you said, it's a confirmation that we're both really onto something here.
Sometimes when Jake talks to me, it's a total buzzkill because I tell him, hey, I came up with this clever theory. It's called test prep pedagogy. And I think instead of testing people, we should be teaching people. And then he says, oh yeah, they were writing about that back in the 90s. You're an idiot. But that's exactly what I want to do. I want to step away from what are we learning from the score and step toward what are we learning toward the score? What are we going to learn to get a better score? Not, not just validate it with the number. But yeah. Let's go to the next slide if you're ready, Jake.
Yeah.
All right. So one of the reasons I think blind review works, and one of the reasons that I think that my triple review works even better, is that it's tapping into some learning science regarding spaced repetition. You guys know that the secret to memorizing things for life is repeating them over and over. Like your favorite songs, you'll never forget. Even after you get Alzheimer's and forget how to make new memories, you will likely still remember some of these songs that have been deeply ingrained into your long-term memory. How does that occur? It occurs through spaced repetition. And if you take only time tests or you only read through strategy guides, you aren't engaging this very established principle in learning science. So how do you bring spaced repetition into the picture? First, you use my triple review. You don't study each prep test once. You don't just study it twice. You study each one 3 times in order to learn all of the lessons and squeeze it for all it's worth. The other thing is the spaced repetition is most efficient when the spacing intervals are the right amount of time. I say that because I don't know what the magic amount of time is, but what I do know is that doing all 4 sections of a prep test and then coming back is too long. And so what I ask my students to do is to take 1 section at a time. You're not going to be able to do well on the LSAT overall until you've mastered each individual section separately. So let's start there. You study 1 section at a time, you do it 3 times, and by the time you're done with the 3rd review, you've really learned something. You haven't just taken another time test, and you haven't just read another strategy book. You've learned about the actual phrasing of the questions and what skill deficits you have, and hopefully how to move forward to improve those.
Yeah, and you know what's vital about this is that each version of the review of the test is aimed at a different thing, a different thing to accomplish. The first time through is aimed at sort of the competitive side of what you're dealing with in testing, which is like, I know that I'm supposed to be getting a score and I need to know what that is. But the second time through is the cognitive side. What do I actually know? So it's not a matter of what do I know in what time and in what framework and with what assumptions, just what do I know? Can I answer all of these questions? Can I do it untimed and really apply everything that I've got to this? And then the third time through is the metacognitive side, right? On top of that, how am I thinking about what do I know, right? How am I thinking about the body of knowledge that I've got and the skills that I have and the things that I want to be able to do the next time around? So there are sort of tiers of learning that you're trying to achieve with each time that you go through a test. Competitive first, cognitive second, and then metacognitive third. And if we really think about that third one in a very different way from, I think, the way most of us think about reviewing the work we do, that's where the real learning comes. I'm going to get on my pedagogy soapbox again. You know, the big problem, especially in high school, but this extends into your undergraduate as well, is that when you receive a paper back, they put a number grade or a letter grade on it. And what's the thing that we do? We look at the number grade or letter grade, and then we stuff it in our bag and we never look at it again, right? This is called quantitative assessment, right? They give you a number and then you know where you rank and then you're done. If instead they held back that number and all they gave you was qualitative feedback, These are the strengths. These are the things you did well. You executed this. Here is, here's a weakness in some of your evidence. I wish you had structured the paper differently, and gave you a week to think about it and work on it first, and then gave you your grade. Think about it the way that you would have engaged in your work in school in a different manner. You have to give yourself that opportunity here too. The important thing isn't how well you did on the section. The important thing is how well you applied what you've learned on the section. The grade will come, the number will come. But if we're not doing it honestly, then we're not really doing a good job at learning. All right.
Next slide. I want to give you guys an overview of the triple review before we start drilling down into each individual section. And so Jake has given you a lead into this. Each review has a different purpose. And so you have to be focused on something different at each step of the process. So step one is to take the timed section, right? This is a 35-minute timed section. And the work product that you want to develop at the end of this is a complete answer sheet. I want my students to physically mark the answers on a piece of paper or on some digital format if you're taking the test online, but I want you to have a record of the answers that you pick. That's an important part of the process, is being able to go back and reconstruct your thinking process. Everybody knows how to take a timed test, but I want you to do this honestly. You set your timer and then treat it as the real thing, which means that you don't keep going when the time's over. And also when the 5-minute warning hits, you have to treat that like you actually have 5 minutes left and execute your 5-minute plan so that you can start to perfect what to do under that time crunch at the end as well. We'll come back to that in a second. Okay, so now you've taken your time test. The purpose of it, Jake calls it the competitive time, or the competitive step. I describe the purpose of it as sort of implementing or testing the strategies that you want to implement or test. And we'll get to that when we get to step 3. What strategies are you testing? You'll have to come up with those. So step 2 now is you've taken your time test. The biggest mistake that I think you can make is looking up the answers. There's a psychological principle called psychological anchoring. And basically it means once you are exposed to something, you can never be unexposed to it. And so now that you know the correct answer, you can never go back and recreate the process of engaging with that question without knowing the correct answer. You've totally tainted that question as a source of study material, and you've gone even further if you've engaged a tutor in an explanation without having gone through some additional steps yet. You've really put a crutch that you're not going to be able to get away from if you're engaging those resources too early. So step 2 is your blind review. You go back through every single question without the benefit of the right answers and you try again, but this time you don't have the anxiety of the time pressure weighing on you. And so you can do a deeper dive into the conceptual matters. You can diagram the conditional statements that you didn't have time to diagram. You can reread things and look for details that you just didn't have time or didn't know how to find on the time test. And so what you're teaching your brain to do is to decipher what's really important and what's not. How do I really get to the right answer, and which roads are dead ends and which roads are traps? That way you're not just trying things out on the test. You've worked out sort of a brute force method, what things work and what things don't work. All right, so now you've done the blind review. I think that you're not going to be able to, you're going to need to satisfy your curiosity at this point. So you can finally look up the answers. At the end of step 2, I want your work product to be another completed answer sheet, a document with a record of the answers that you picked so that you've gone on record as choosing an answer. And then you can reflect back on how did I do? And there's no way to equivocate and say, yeah, I really understood it. If you chose the wrong answer, you didn't. That's the bottom line. So now that you've done the section twice, you've looked up the answers. Step 3 is something that I think is really missing from almost every other method out there. I haven't seen any good tutors really until I met Jake that were talking about a robust strategy review. And so I call this the meta-analysis. What you have to do is go back and think about What was I thinking about during my time section when I did this question? What was I thinking about when I redid it during the blind review? And how can I combine the lessons from those two experiences to come up with a better way to attack that kind of question or this kind of section or that kind of game, whatever the scenario is? This is the really challenging step that a lot of students aren't even doing. And this is where a lot of students can benefit from working with a tutor, working from me. And if you're doing my small group sessions or our October class, I think this step 3 is where we're going to spend a lot of our group time, where you've already done step 1, you've already done step 2, and now we're trying to synthesize, well, what do we do about it? How can we synthesize a strategy for this or that that takes advantage of everything we've learned in step 1 and step 2? You want to jump in, Jake?
Yeah, what's so interesting about this process is that it's so similar to the way that people train athletically and the way that people train on a musical instrument, but it's not something that gets implemented in education all that often. If you think about a runner, right? A runner will time themselves and really see, what is my mile time? What is my 100-meter time? But that's a very small portion of the training, right? It's not all that often that they actually put themselves into the competitive paradigm. Instead, they spend a lot of their time doing cross training, right? They have a coach, they are doing strength training, they are reviewing their technique, they're reviewing all sorts of other material and doing things that are seemingly ancillary to somebody that doesn't really know anything about running. But to a runner, and especially to a running professional, they know that those are the keys. And so when we talk about blind review and strategy review, those are all those training bits. Those are all those things that are going to improve us so that when we put it into action on a full-timed practice test, that we actually have something to demonstrate. Those of you who have worked with me know I love sports analogies. I always talk about tennis because tennis is the one that's sort of the low-hanging fruit, right? Anybody can pick up a tennis racket and go and play with their friends. And if we do that every day for a couple hours, sure, we'll get better. But there are much better ways to get better than just go out and play tennis. You have to learn how to serve. You have to learn how to hold the racket. You have to have a coach with a bucket of balls teaching you just the right way to approach each kind of shot so that when you get into the moment, when you get into the pressure of the test environment or the tennis match environment, you don't have to think about that strategy anymore. It's more deeply ingrained. But if you're just going fly by night and just peppering yourself with test after test after test after test, you haven't actually developed a strategy. And so the development of the strategy, that concrete action plan that Keith is talking about as the work product of strategy review, that's the most critical part of all of this. If we don't have that, we've got nothing to bring with us the next time around.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. I want to discuss the 3 steps in more detail and how to implement that for each of the 3 different kinds of sections, because I do think there are some limitations to the strategy and some ways that you can make it more efficient for certain sections. Okay, so we'll begin with the logic game section. Now, we were just talking about the action plan from step 3. When you take a time section, what I want you to do, if you've been doing the triple review for a while, is you're going to pull out your action plan that you developed the last time you did that kind of section, and then you have to implement the action plan, and it should consist of 2 or 3 concrete strategy adjustments that you intend to make because you identified those as beneficial to your score. These were things that you missed or weaknesses in your strategy from the previous section. Now, some of you haven't done blind review. Many of you haven't done triple review before. So I've given you what I think are 2 concrete action plan goals that you can implement right away, especially if you're just starting out for logic games. So first of all, when you are doing a time section, you should be attacking the games in essentially order of difficulty from easiest to hardest. And the easiest games are typically the simple order games. The hardest games are typically the hybrid or the irregular games. So if you just learn to recognize what kind of game you're dealing with, and then prioritize your time by starting with the easy ones, ending with the hard ones, you're already making a smart strategic choice. The other thing that you can do is you can implement this exact same strategy within each game. So I don't do the questions in exactly the order that they give them to me. Instead, I start with the more specific questions because I find those to be more simple. And then I go back and complete the general or complex questions. What I mean by that is if a logic game question begins with if blah, 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 and they feed me some information, I'm going to key in on those questions first. And I'm going to develop a library of work so that when I get to the questions that don't feed me information, which of the following could be true, I have some information to use to eliminate a few answers and cut down the workflow. So some of the early adjustments that you can make involve just attacking the games in the right order, attacking the questions in the right order. But naturally, as you get better at games, your action plan is going to become more and more sophisticated, and you'll start incorporating deeper elements like how to make stronger inferences, or how much time to spend making inferences, or when to give up on a complex rule substitution question. There'll be other action plan items that you'll need to add as you proceed through the process. Jake?
Yeah, the thing about games is that it's the first step to attacking a time section in a game is having the ability to identify which games are easy for you. And so one of the first metacognitive steps for me when working with a student is know what you're good at. If you're good at linear, if you're good at categories, whatever it is that you're good at, if you can start to be able to look at a game and immediately say, this is a linear, it's a simple linear, there are no subcategories, there's no nothing, I'm just going to be able to like brute force and go with this one. Great, I'm going to do that one first. Then I'm going to find the next one, and then I'm going to find, and so that's that highest level of metacognition. The second one is knowing in timed conditions, the old saw, know thyself, right? What are the kinds of questions that I'm good at and the ones that I'm not? If I identify, look, here's a game and the first three questions were a cinch for me, but these last two, one of them's a rule sub and one of them is, a weird conditional must be true or necessary condition or something, and that's going to take too long and I'm going to freak out about it and I'd rather go on to the next game. That can be a strategy for you until you get to the point that you learn something, but that you have to make sure that when you come back to it in blind review or strategy review, that you recognize that that's a thing you need to work on, that you give it a big circle and you bring it to your resources and deal with it. But having that action plan when it comes to games can be straightforward if you have a straightforward action plan. If you feel like Kermit the Frog and you're flailing your arms every time you see a game where you don't understand one of the rules, then you're not giving yourself an opportunity to get right answers. So lowest hanging fruit first is absolutely the right way to go. That doesn't color the rest of the section.
I forgot to mention something here. I have a lot of students who are reluctant to do time sections, and I have to really prod them. I'll tell them about the triple review. I'll send them off to go do it, and then they'll come back and say, I knew I wasn't going to perform well on the section, so I did this instead. And they'll tell me what they chose to do instead of triple review. So I want to kind of head that off and tell you guys that part of the process here is failing. I understand that your first few time sections are going to be horrible, but you have to experience this in order to understand how much time pressure is at stake, in order to understand what kinds of strategic adjustments are actually going to matter in that environment. And so I don't want you to spend a ton of time in those strategy guides and then not spend enough time in, failing at the time section to actually know which strategies you need to start picking to get better. In other words, we need to know where you are. And where you are is not adopting the entire Power Score book and implementing it tomorrow. That's tutor level expertise, not student level expertise. So you have to start wherever you are and then pick your gains as they are reasonable, rather than trying to implement another strategy top down. That's why I want my students to start with that time section. Let's see what happens. If it goes poorly, so what? Well, we'll fix it. Well, I'll teach you some strategies. We'll go from there.
Yeah, and two things on that front. One is my sports analogy, right? When you go to the gym for the first time and you decide to start lifting weights, but you shouldn't pick up the 100-pound dumbbell, right? That's ridiculous. You're not going to bicep curl on a 100-pound dumbbell the first time you go. But neither should you be doing 5 pounds. begins. You have to know where you are, right? Where do you start and where's good for you? But if you pick up the 5-pound weight and you just constantly lift the 5-pound weight over and over and over again, you're not going to get any stronger. You do have to find a fail point. And the fail point is what allows you to get stronger. Those of you who have been frequenting the Facebook group the last couple of days have seen me talking about growth mindset a lot. And this is Carol Dweck's whole point, right? That we can't get people things that are so challenging that they withdraw, but neither can we give them things that are so straightforward and so deeply in their wheelhouse that they reject everything that's difficult for them because they're scared to fail. Failing is how we learn. And without failure, we don't know where our weaknesses are and we don't know where to point ourselves. But pointing ourselves at our strengths only doesn't get us there. We have to give ourselves an opportunity to fail and then pick ourselves up and analyze and move on.
I better pick up that book, huh?
It's a great book. I'll send you.
I'm interested. Okay, so moving on, for logic games, here's what I think the blind review should look like. Remember, this is the second step of the triple review process, the blind review. Number one, don't look up the correct answers. It's a crutch. It will taint your review process. And I understand the desire to get the confirmation, but just delay it a little bit and try the blind review for a couple of times. And I promise you'll start to see the merits of it. For logic games, the blind review process for me is really simple. Do all 4 games again, except this time with the timer off, you can explore every single road you want to explore. Step point 4 here is I don't mind if you brute force every single solution, because I promise you'll learn something as you go through that process of brute forcing it. The other thing is students often come to me and say, I didn't blind review this game because I didn't know how to set it up. And it's just like a facepalm moment for me. I think you missed such a perfect opportunity to learn something here. You take the several diagrams that you are contemplating in your head and you try them all. You don't have to know which one is best to study. I tell my students, you create contrasting ones. You set them up side by side. If you're thinking, I don't know if this way of diagramming is better than that one, create both, symbolize all the rules using each separately, start answering the questions. I'd be surprised if you even get that far before you realize which one is better. Certainly by the time you've done a few questions, you will have gravitated toward one of your diagrams over the other. And what's really remarkable about doing it this way, rather than having the tutor tell you which one is better, is that you're not just going to know which one's better, but you're going to know why. And you're going to know which elements of that game gave you trouble or demanded that particular diagram, so that when that pattern appears in the future, you don't need the tutor to say this diagram is better, because you've already figured out why the other one is worse.
Yeah, and you know what's also interesting about this, and you know I've been saying this all week to people. I'm a huge advocate of brute force all the time. And the reason I say that is that I see a lot of students struggling to make inferences and sitting there staring at rules saying, well, where are the inferences? I know there's supposed to be inferences, but I don't see them. I don't see them. I don't see them. And the truth is that logic games is at its core a mathematical construction. So the tie-in that I give people is you think about the great mathematicians of the modern world, or even the ancient world, and the truth is that those mathematicians didn't arrive at the conclusions that they arrived at by deriving rules in their heads. They sat down with pages and reams of paper and wrote out patterns and wrote out ideas and drew diagrams until the patterns jumped out of the page at them. And they said, oh my God, like Euclid said, oh my God, here's this system for numbers that I didn't realize was there, right? And Pythagoras said, wow, I drew this diagram and suddenly I can see that these areas match up with each other. He didn't just think of it. He had to do it first. And the only way to draw inferences, to get good at drawing inferences, is to get really good at doing brute force. And you're going to find with games that as you insist upon doing brute force, it's just as fast. Sometimes it's faster. And you're going to find that blind review on games, if you have 4 games that are not super mysterious and there are no weird diagrams and there's nothing super hybrid or strange about it, right? But if they're relatively straightforward, you're going to finish nearly as fast and you're going to answer more questions. That's the big secret here, is that when you give yourself permission to do it brute force, what you think is the long way, it might not be the long way.
You just reminded me of a story. I want to do a 2-minute tangent here.
Woohoo!
I used to teach science in a previous life. At the college level, I was teaching a physiology class at Southwestern University one year, and I overheard a student talking to another, and she said she was studying for her organic chemistry final exam. And I cut into her conversation. I said, I'm going to give you some advice. I know your professor told you that there are principles that drive organic chemistry, but screw all that. The way to get a good grade in that class is to memorize the crap out of that stuff. Make yourself some flashcards right now, start memorizing, and don't stop, and don't look for patterns and principles, memorize. So I told her this, and I said, your professor lied to you. The patterns are not the way to go. And she said to me, you know, it's funny. At the beginning of the semester, you told us this about physiology, that we should look for these patterns and that there are principles that drive the whole show and that you don't have to do all this memorizing. And I had this aha moment that when you are an expert in a field, those patterns are so obvious to you that it seems like you can make a shortcut for the student. You can just tell them the pattern. But what you're missing is that it took years and years and years of memorization and study before that pattern made sense to you. Why the teachers think that it can immediately make sense to the student is it's illogical, right? They're trying to create a shortcut that doesn't work. And so I agree with Jake that the brute force, there is an element of memorization. There is an element of, you know, what is a deduction? The way that you prove the deduction is you have to have every single solution. Without that, you haven't truly proven it. Brute force is the way to make the deduction. If you want to be honest about it, we can create shortcuts, sure, but you haven't truly proven the deduction until you've laid out every single solution and shown me that A is actually first in everyone. Anything short of that, and I'm going to say, well, yeah, but what if?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And, you know, I teach a lot of math, and I spend a lot of time with middle school and high school kids who ask me, just tell me the formula. I just want to know the formula so I can memorize it and move on. And I say, if I tell you the formula, you're never going to remember this. You're never going to learn anything. You're not going to make connections. Learning math is not about calculating stuff. It's about understanding patterns in the world. LSAT games is not about calculating things. It's about understanding how the rules interact with each other. But you can't know that until you immerse yourself in the world. And the only way to do that is through brute force. I said this to one of my students who's on with us tonight. Hi, Michelle. You have to iterate. Stop thinking about it. Start doing it. And when you do it, right, you take the Nike approach. You just do it and do it a bunch. You're going to do 4 or 5 iterations. And you say, oh my God, T is 7th every time. Why? And then you're going to ask yourself that question backwards. You're going to realize it. And maybe not the next game. And maybe not the game after that, but maybe 5 games down the road, when this happens often enough, all of these synapses and all of these neurons that are making connections and that you're growing and flexing over the course of time of doing this test are going to start making those connections for you. I was not born being able to do this. And this is fixed mindset, growth mindset, right? I am not the kind of person who's good at the LSAT. I'm good at the LSAT because I sat down, I took it, I worked at it, I taught it, I worked at it some more, I taught it some more, and now I'm an expert at it because I'm there. That's the same reason I presume Keith is good at it. And it's the same reason why you all will be good at it if you stop thinking about each practice test as a single entity. Right? I'm good at the LSAT because I've done all 90 tests, not once, but 20 times, 30 times, 50 times. I've taught them all. I've had to explain them all to different people. You have to explain these games to yourself. And the only way you do that is by exploring the whole world. That's why blind review is so valuable.
Well, let's talk about the strategy review now. My strategy review for logic games is also very simple. You go ahead and look up your answers. I understand that you need to evaluate your progress and compare, you know, how did you do on your time test? How did you do on your blind review? For your strategy review, I want you to repeat all 4 games again. But remember that your focus has to be different each time. The first time you're focused on timing and how to get better at that and implement your strategies. The second time you're trying to build conceptual connections, make those synapses fire at the right time to understand the right concepts. But for the strategy review, your focus has to be, how do I take what I've learned in step 2 and make it applicable to step 1? It's about learning how to recognize the patterns or thinking about why particular things worked or didn't work. So how do you go about doing that? You repeat all 4 games, but before you do, you create what I call a diagram timeline. You take your diagram from the time test, lay it out. Take your diagram from the blind review, or maybe your diagrams from the blind review. And this time, when you make your 3rd diagram, it should be an improvement on everything you've done before. If after that much thought and study, you cannot go back and improve upon your effort, I think you haven't really reflected deeply enough, or you don't know how to engage in the reflection process. There should be things you can think of at this step where you say, what do you wish you had done the first time, essentially? What were the deductions that you figured out through brute force? Go ahead and notate them now that you know they exist. So you improve upon your diagram by comparing your 3rd approach to the previous ones. The other thing you can do now, I mentioned that I think consulting professionals too soon is a crutch. At some point, I do think that you've hit your conceptual limit to figure it out on your own. Now, once you've engaged in a time test and a blind review, that's when I think that the resources become much more valuable. So go ahead and pull out Power Score. If you're having trouble with ordered games, go ahead and pull up the 7-Sage explanation of a particular logic game. Or go ahead and make an appointment with a tutor if you can't figure out how to create a highly efficient diagram on your strategy review. But you've learned a lot at that point about what are the right questions to ask the tutor and how to engage with them to get better, rather than just sitting back and saying, teach me something, teach me how to take the test. All right, so consult the resources. Whatever resources you have access to and can afford, go get them now. This is the time to engage with them. Improve your diagram and your strategy. And then the most important part of this is you create your action plan. And so as you're reflecting on your timed approach, your blind review diagrams, and then your strategy review diagram, you have to think about, what did I do wrong and how do I get better? Maybe the issue was that you missed a deduction and you need a better process for finding it. Or maybe you shouldn't be looking for deductions at all because Jake's on the right track and there's more of a brute force method that works for you. But you have to come up with some idea about what you're going to do. And for many students, what I find is that in the heat of the time test, it's time traps are the problem. It's rarely just deep conceptual things that went wrong. Usually they got hung up on something and didn't really know how to move forward or how to. So what are you going to do to create a better time plan? Did you get caught up early on a difficult game? Then you need a better strategy for analyzing the difficulty of the games and prioritizing better. And as I mentioned before, the action plan is very personalized. It depends on what you've missed. And so that's a difficult step of the process where I think that we can really help you in some of the sessions that we'll have in the future. Yeah. All right, what do you think about the strategy review, Jake?
Well, I mean, this is right on. The thing for me to add here is that it's really important when we go to the resources, and it's not just the books or the video sites or the explanation sites, it's also your tutor, that we don't simply take what they tell us at face value and say, well, I guess that was the way. Because when we do that, we give up our job as the rider of the elephant, driving the elephant forward, right? We have to be riding the elephant. And so, no matter how smart and insightful Keith is, and no matter how smart and insightful I am, we're still talking from our own language and from our own understanding and our own perspective. And it's your responsibility to take that resource and translate it into your own language. So for instance, I had a logic game session the other day in which we were talking about diagramming a rule and the student used a subscript in a way that I wouldn't use a subscript. That's not the way I do it. I use subscripts for something different. And I said, well, okay, if that's how you use subscripts, how do you handle X? And the explanation was something that I said, okay, fine. It doesn't matter to me. A system is a system. Any system can work as long as it's consistent and it's thorough. So if you go to 7Sage, you go to LSAT Hacks and you read their explanation, don't stop there. Translate it into your own understanding, your own vocabulary for the test, and re-implement it again, right? If you've done all 4 games and then you've gone to the resource and the resource has told you something that you didn't see, stop, do that game again and re-diagram it or write the rules out a different way and see if that improves your understanding of how to do it. But do it your way, don't do it their way, right? Make sure you pass it through your own filter. The other part of this, and you'll hear me repeat this a lot about the action plan portion of things. The action plan has got to be something positive and actionable, right? You can't script for yourself things not to do, because when you script for yourself things not to do, you're focused on the things you're not supposed to do, and then you do them, right? This again is a very sports psychology kind of thing. I don't know if anybody plays golf, but you know, anybody who's ever swung a golf club before knows that if you're constantly saying to yourself, don't hit the ground, don't hit the ground, don't hit the ground, you're going to hit the ground. That's all that's going to happen, right? So for this, it's about saying to yourself, this is what I'm going to do. This is the vision of me, my identity as a games person. And my identity is I am the person that writes out beautiful rules. And I'm going to spend more time next time writing out rules that really describe this game in such a way that I don't have to refer back to the written rules ever again. I'm going to write them out perfectly next time. And I'm going to waste time doing it so that I make sure that I don't have wrong rules there. Right? So it's got to be something positive. I'm going to write beautiful rules. I'm going to iterate more. I'm going to allow deductions to come to me rather than saying, I'm not going to look for deductions up front. I will allow deductions to come from me. And that, for it, as crunchy and granola as that sounds, it's actually hugely valuable psychological warfare on yourself and on your instincts, to not allow yourself to get hung up on all the ways that you think you're not good enough or you think you're not doing well enough. No, these are the things I do well and I'm going to improve on them. And these are the ways that I'm going to improve. It's critical when you have your action plan to make sure they're phrased positively for yourself. There we go.
All right, let's talk about logical reasoning, arguments, and go through the 3 steps, because there's a couple of different things you can do for LR to make the process more efficient. So beginning with the time sections, you always want to have your action plan. Well, if you're just beginning to study, or if you haven't thought about strategic adjustments before, you might not have an action plan. So I'll just propose some of these positive adjustments that you can make that Jake is talking about, because he's absolutely right. I admonish my students all the time. If you say things to yourself like, I will pay more attention, I'll look for details harder. To me, that's like going to the gym and saying, I'm going to try harder today. I'm going to push harder. That doesn't make you stronger. You get stronger by executing the exercise day after day after day. And what's funny about the approach is that if you do that, you don't have to try to be stronger. There is no extra effort involved at the end of the process. You simply are stronger. And if you do this triple review process, you won't have to try to go faster, try to be better, try to be smarter. You will be. You will be smarter and you will be a better reader, and your scores will automatically go up without any extra effort at all. When I started teaching this method, I thought I was going to teach myself right out of a job, because I saw so many students take it and implement it successfully and then start to distance themselves from me as a tutor because they could do it themselves. I had to start increasing my rate, because in 1 or 2 lessons, I could give people really so much value that they weren't getting elsewhere, that they could leave me at that point and still be better off than they were before the engagement. All right, so here's my action plan for beginning students for LR. Low-hanging fruit, we've mentioned this phrase before, but I think for LR it makes the most sense, because you've got 27, 28 questions or 26 questions, and they're all equally valuable, except that they all aren't equally difficult. And so the key to LR is getting the easiest questions as quickly as possible and making sure that you don't waste time on the hard questions. Then you can evaluate once you've got your easy questions down and you've strategically skipped what you've identified to be the hard questions. Then you've gained a lot of information. You know how much time you have to allocate to the hard questions, and you can plan better. If you've got plenty of time with just a few hard questions left to go, great. You've got time to actually sort out the answers to those. If you have a real time crunch and lots of hard questions left to go, that's a different scenario. You're gonna have to guess on a bunch of them. But knowing that helps you to prioritize your time and say, what I really have time for is 2 or 3 more questions out of the remaining 10.
You know, on that point, before we go on, you know, it's also critical to know where you are in the process. If you're somebody who's at, you know, only getting 3 or 4 wrong on an LR section, this is less critical. But if you're getting 15 wrong, right, it means that what you can do is identify the 2 or 3 or 4 types of questions that you're good at, right? I'm good at identifying conclusions. I'm good at identifying flaws. I'm good at identifying assumptions. I'm good at the structure of the argument questions, and I'm good at paradoxes. Fine. Go out and answer those first. That's probably going to account for 12 to 15 questions. You get most of those right and guess randomly on the rest, you're already at 17. And you don't have to even read the rest of the questions, and you've improved your score by 7 points. So it's really important to know where you are, right? And that's the first step, is to say, okay, fine. Let me figure out what I actually know and what I can actually do well. And you realize that there is a process by which you can navigate a timed section that really optimizes the things you're good at and allows you to know in your strategy review, when we get to that on LR, to look back and say, hey, look, I did it. I did it. I did my conclusion questions. I did my evidence questions. I did my paradoxes and my conflicting opinions. And I got 13 of them right out of 15, and then the rest I guessed on, and I got the 3 right that I was supposed to get right on those 12 questions, and I ended up with a much higher score, which means this is an effective method for a timed section. And now when I do blind review, fine, then I'll do them all, and I'll really engage with them the right way and figure out what I know and don't know. But it's a really valuable way to think about a timed section.
You know, the next 2 items here are 2 things that were taught to me by my trainer at Princeton Review years ago when I was first learning to teach LSAT. I had a really terrific trainer. I usually give him a shout out. His name's Doug Couchman. He does some LSAT tutoring out in Berkeley. And I was really fortunate to learn from this guy. He taught me 2 things the very first day of my LR training that instantly made me better at LR. And the improvement was so palpable and so quick that advice to the contrary makes little sense to me. I may just be completely biased because of my own experience. But the first thing he taught me was read the questions before the arguments. And prior to that, I had just fallen into the pattern of reading everything in the order that they give it to me. And what I discovered is that if you read the question first, you kind of learn what to look for, and much of the argument becomes irrelevant. If they're asking me for the conclusion, I can become hyper-focused on the conclusion of the argument, ignore the evidence, not worry about the flaw, and make sure that my attention is focused on finding a very accurate paraphrase of the conclusion. It's about allocating my resources like a computer. I can't do everything. I have to pick and choose what I'm going to do. And so reading the question first really helps me to become focused on what it is I want to do. That's sort of an advanced skill, though. It requires you to kind of know the different questions and what to do differently. But I think that should be your ultimate goal, to know all the different question types and what to do differently when you encounter them. So start reading the questions first. The other thing that Doug Couchman taught me, and this one was more difficult for me to figure out. He said, start underlining the conclusions, because this was back in the dark ages when it was a paper and pencil test. But I've switched it up to say highlight the conclusions. Of every argument that has a conclusion, I want my students to highlight it. And I tell them this knowing full well that there are negative reports about the highlight feature on the exam. And so now you're going to say, so why would I continue to give that advice knowing that there are technical flaws with the tablets? It's because I've tapped into something, or I believe I've tapped into something, and I've become very enamored with visual methods. I've noticed that people get very good at logic games, often fail to improve at reading comprehension, and after teaching for many years, it struck me as not a coincidence that we were teaching highly visual methods for logic games and absolutely no visual methods for reading comprehension. And so I look back at this advice that Doug Couchman gave me, underlining these conclusions. I've been doing it for years at this point and teaching LSAT for years. And I started thinking about, what is that doing to me psychologically as a test taker? And it's doing two things for me. Number one, it's giving me mental permission to stop thinking about the conclusion for a minute. I think about it like writing down a phone number. Imagine I tell you, remember this phone number, and you're cycling it in your head. As soon as you get it down on paper, you stop. Nobody continues to cycle the numbers once you've written it down. You have mental permission to stop thinking about it because you have an easy resource to access to find it. It's underlined, it's visual. You know right where to look if you need to remind yourself what the conclusion is. And so that's the second point, is that it serves as a visual anchor. When you get confused, when you have digested more than 7 chunks of information for the answer choices, and you can no longer remember those details from the argument, the question now becomes, what are you going to do about it? And the answer can't be, I'm going to read better and remember better, because science says you won't. Science says you have a limited working memory, and you're never going to be able to remember every single detail from every argument after consuming all of the details from every single answer choice. Impossible unless you're some kind of savant. So what are you going to do at that critical moment when you're down to 2 answer choices? Well, if you have this visual cue and that conclusion is underlined, it will draw your attention back. And what I tell my students is you reread the conclusion every time, because that reminds you of the scope of the argument, and the scope of the argument often settles the debate between the 2 answer choices that you're debating. Rereading the 2 answer choices will never settle the debate. The distinction between the 2 is there, but how to decide, how to navigate that distinction, how to decide which side of the distinction is correct, that's above, that's in the argument. And so at some point, you have to go back and find the answer. And my solution is you anchor yourself to the conclusion and you reread that. That's your starting point. And you have a visual cue to do it. Go ahead, Jake.
Yeah. So yes, yes, and yes, and yes, and the last part is yes. And to extend Keith's point about the visual anchor, as he said, your working memory is limited, and the truth is that if it's not possible to obtain all that information from those 27 questions and retain it all, why are you trying to? All it's doing is making things harder. In fact, your strategy should be to do exactly the opposite. Your strategy should be able to get you through an argument question, an LR question, get the right answer, and then never, ever think about it again. That should be the objective. You should be able to get the right answer and have it exit your memory. I don't know if anybody has ever taken the ACT. There is the section at the end of the ACT is this science section. And it's got 7 experiments and graphs and charts and numbers and all sorts of interpolations and extrapolations. And every student that sees it the first time says, how on earth am I supposed to understand all of this? And the answer is, you're not. That's not the point. You don't even have to read any of it. Read the questions, know what they're looking for, go find it. Once you've found it, that's the answer, and then move on. And I can do one of these sections and not tell you a thing about what I just read. And that's kind of what the LR is about, right? It's about saying, look, this is a question that's asking for a sufficient assumption. I have to tie my premise to the end of my conclusion. I have to figure out a way to do that, right? How far do the premises take me? How far do I need to get? I need to find something that does at least that and hopefully more, because that would be a sufficient assumption. And once I found it, great. I don't care if we're talking about trucks or gasoline or art theory, or it doesn't matter, right? And it shouldn't matter to you. If you're trying to understand what's in the LR, you're expending intellectual and psychic energy that's going to drain you to the point where when you get to question number 20, you're not going to have anything left in the tank. And then you have no shot at the end of the section. You have to keep some in reserves, and you keep some in reserves by not worrying so much about understanding the content, but you distilling the content into its structure. And so that's why you highlight the conclusion, because that helps you do that. All right.
Okay, so once you've done your timed step, remember that the next step is the blind review. And I'm going to keep hammering this home because the psychological tendency is so strong to want to look up the answers. Don't do it. Not knowing the answers is helpful to allowing you to engage with the questions in a meaningful way on this blind review. Now, my blind review for LR looks a lot like the blind review for logic games. I want you to do every single question again untimed. And same thing, deep conceptual dive. Use whatever tool you think will help you other than the answer key or an explanation. And so I think diagramming and visual aids are extremely powerful. I don't think that there are a lot of good diagramming tools for logical reasoning. And Jake and I have been trying to develop one that we call circuit logic. And we're doing a webinar on that 1 week from today. I would encourage all of you to attend that because it's really fun. And it's also a robust way to start to visualize deductive logic so that when you hit roadblocks on your blind review and you say to yourself, I don't even know what this argument is saying, you have a strategy in place, just like you do for logic games, to start to organize the information, think about how it relates, and how we might draw conclusions from that information. So I'm really stoked about this diagramming strategy, and I hope that you guys will join us next week. Those of you who work with me for LR review will probably get exposed to this numerous times because it's how I think about logical reasoning. But when I talk about diagramming, I also mean conditional diagramming, circling, anything that helps you navigate the argument.
Yeah,
and
you know, I talk about a toolkit, and you want to expand your toolkit, right? And so we all have learned about conditionals. That's part of sort of the basics of LSAT training. And I hope everybody's been exposed to Venn diagrams and uses Venn diagrams. And you know, this circuit logic is sort of it's not a new trick. It's a comprehensive way to visualize the entire system. It's the whole ecosystem of it rather than just one way to get there. But it's just one thing in the toolkit, and your toolkit needs to be robust. You need to have a lot of options at your disposal, and the blind review is your opportunity to sort of implement that.
The last thing you need to make sure you're doing on your blind review is that every single question must have concrete bases for your decisions. And so I often have my students write these out when they when they're stubborn about this. And so I want on the blind review for you to actually think about, for every single answer choice, what is my reason for choosing this, and what is my reason for eliminating this? And you should be able to come up with some words that express that, not just a feeling or an idea that it's correct or incorrect. When you can start to explain why something is correct or incorrect, the vocabulary helps you to grapple with the ideas. There's some kind of feedback between language and thinking that is interesting here. Once you name something, it becomes less mysterious. And so being able to talk about things in a principled way by articulating these bases and thinking about the language that we use to talk about logical fallacies, all of that will help you get to a more streamlined place where you're identifying these more easily.
And it's also hugely valuable when we get to strategy review to have a trail, a record trail here of what your thinking was in the moment. One thing that I didn't mention with games, and I'll mention it here because it's very relevant for LR. You have to leave time between your time section and your blind review. You can't do them right back to back. Because if you do, all you're going to do is reinforce the approach that you took the first time around. You need an opportunity to breathe, even if it's half an hour, just to say, okay, let me try to flush my brain a little bit and start again. But then you need a record. You need an accounting of, this was my justification, so that in strategy review, you can go to these questions and you can say, man, like, I had all the time in the world in blind review, and this is what I came to. This was my conclusion. Very clearly, I don't understand the difference between necessary and sufficient. Very clearly, I don't understand what they're asking for when they ask X, Y, or Z. And very clearly, I'm not good at diagramming conditionals when it comes to parallel premises. So in strategy review, that's your opportunity to look back at what you did in blind review, and you can't have enough. Your working memory of what you were thinking during blind review is not going to be robust enough to be able to really draw information from it. So having a record, even if it's as simple as this is an issue of causation. Like causation does not equal correlation, or does not, no mechanism for causation, or, you know, whatever it is. It can be a phrase, but it has to be something that you can go back to, understand what you meant, right? So that you can then take that forward and learn something from it.
Sometimes it's as simple as circling the strong language. If you think all is the source of the problem, circle the word all so that you know that that was what you identified. All right, let's talk about the strategy review for logical reasoning. Now here, I think that when you've done a question twice and gotten it correct twice, the utility of repeating it a third time is not the same for games. It doesn't have the same kind of calculation aspect to it. So I give my students a little break here on LR and I tell them, once you've done 2 reviews and you've looked up the answers, now it's really about tackling your errors. And so you can focus more on the questions that you missed, either on the time test or the blind review. So I don't give them a complete break. If you fixed your error, you don't get to just forget about it. You have to go back and think about that, why you got it wrong time to begin with. All right, so one of the things, I've learned this little trick. As a teacher, I learned early in my career that when you're lecturing or teaching a student, you should always confirm that the student understands what's going on before you move on to the next thing. So it's my regular practice when I'm working with a student to ask them, does that make sense to you before we go on to the next question? Sometimes they'll say no, and we'll continue talking about it, but frequently they'll say, yeah, I get it. Thanks for the explanation. One day I was working with a student, and after he told me he understood it, I thought of a very clever way of changing the correct answer that he chose in the incorrect answer that he chose into a correct answer. It just occurred to me that you could manipulate the language a little bit and make it correct. And so as an exercise, I threw it back at him and I said, all right, well, if you truly get it, you tell me this, turn that right answer that you chose into a correct one. What language would we have to change to do it? And he was stumped. And this really bugged me because I realized that I hadn't explained it to him. He didn't get what I was really trying to convey here. And what's more, my method of figuring out whether the student understands it was bad. And so I came up with this new method instead. Every time a student asks me for an explanation, I tell them, I'll give you the explanation for the question, but you're going to get a follow-up question and I won't let you off the hook until you answer it. And that is, how do you take your wrong answer and make it right? And you got 3 options. Here's how I tell my students to do it. You can either change some detail in the wrong answer to convert it into a right one. You can change some detail in the argument if that's easier. I don't really care how you manipulate this, but let's make sure you understand which argument, which question, and which answer is going to constitute a correct sequence. Or the other thing you can do is just change the question. For example, if you are working a strengthened question and you chose something that weakened the argument, I think it's acceptable to say, had this been a weakened question, my answer would have been correct. But you have to demonstrate that you understand when the language would be correct or what massages you need to make to the language to fix it. So how do you get there? Go ahead, Jake. You want to jump in?
Yeah. I mean, look, the Keith's story here is super powerful, and it comes back to this idea of being our own teacher. What's so hard about that moment for both Keith and the student is that the student didn't know what he didn't know. Right? And that's that metacognitive piece that I was talking about at the beginning. This is your opportunity to analyze what you know and what you don't know. But being self-aware enough to do that is so hard. So we need mechanisms to reveal it to ourselves. So if we hold ourselves accountable to saying, I can't move on from this question that I got wrong until I can demonstrate why the wrong answer that I chose could be right under different circumstances, and why the correct answer that I chose is the only one among them that serves the question. In other words, the question is asking for something. There may be a bunch of things that are true, but only one thing is correct. There's only one thing that answers the question. And so we need to make sure that we can do that. It's a mechanism to get you to the metacognition, right? Because the answer at the end, that action plan, that number 5, is, what did I not know that I know I need to know now? which is a really confusing way of saying, right, this is how I am going to learn the thing, not just what the thing is, but how I'm going to go about learning it and implementing it. And this is the opportunity to do that. And that's why, you know, Keith and I as teachers encounter this all the time. We see students who think they understand something. We know they don't, but figuring out a way to demonstrate that to them, getting them to open up about the fact that it's okay to admit a lack of understanding, and then open enough to adopt a new understanding, a new way of thinking. That's very challenging. It's all the more challenging for you to do to yourself.
Yeah, it's almost psychologically painful to go through it. I've heard it described this way. There's a certain amount of psychological angst or pain that goes along with learning, because it always coincides with recognizing that you don't know something. One of the things that I did accidentally here is I skipped to point 4. So let me back up and get us back to how do you get to the point where you are asking how to convert the wrong answer to a right one. When you're first looking at the questions that you got wrong, I want you to start by articulating what are all the merits of the correct answer. Lay out every argument you can for why that's correct. And also, what are the demerits of the wrong answers that you chose? Right? What could possibly be wrong with those, or what makes those worse than the correct answer? And if you have trouble answering those questions, there are plenty of resources. So again, the strategy review is the time point when the resources become helpful. I'm not a big fan of PowerScore's books as an overall strategy, but Jake likes to describe them as an encyclopedia. If you're having trouble with necessary assumption questions, that's a great resource for one chapter at a time. And so if you're having trouble with some specific thing, you go look at a database or a book and you figure out how to rationalize that particular question. And then that's what should get you to step 4. If you truly understand those lessons from the resources, from your tutor, etc., you should be able to engage step 4, which is explaining how to turn your wrong answer into a right one. And then finally, of course, the action plan. It's the same as the other sections. You need 2 or 3. If you do too many, it's useless. So you need 2 or 3 things that you've identified from your from your strategy review that you can do better. And this involves looking at how you performed on the question timed, how you performed on it untimed, and then thinking of a way or a shortcut to get to the right answer sooner or quicker on your next time test. And it's perfectly fine if your answer is, I can't. That question is off the table for me. That is a mature, honest, realistic answer to how to get better at this exam.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to understand the specificity necessary in an action plan. It's not like he said on the previous, it's not good enough to say, stop sucking at arguments, or right, like that's just, it's not going to get us there, right? It needs to be more specific than that. When I read a question stem, I'm going to translate it for myself into my own terminology, understand what I'm looking for, and go find it. When I see a question that involves parallel reasoning, I'm going to diagram the reasoning as well as I can, and then go to the answer choices, right? And again, it's very positive thoughts, not, you know, stop mistaking sufficient for necessary, right? Then all you do is create angst around the idea of sufficient to necessary. We come up with actionable, straightforward, memorizable ideas, right? As if you were pinning them above your computer as you were looking at the next test, that you can go back to them time and time and time again, right? As a baseball player walks up to the plate, he's got 2 swing thoughts that have to do with the pitcher that's throwing the ball, right? Look for the curve, swing away at the fastball, or, you know, or whatever it is for that particular situation. But that's the mantra for the moment, and you need a mantra for the moment, and that's what the action plan should be.
Okay, so reading comprehension. What are we going to do? This looks really similar. You're going to do a time section. And if you don't have an action plan, the action plan for RC looks a lot like the action plan for logic games, because the sections are structured so similarly with 4 discrete units. So you want to make sure that you're working the passages from easiest to hardest. It's not always easy to know which passage is easy or hard. You need to incorporate some strategy to find out. For me, that usually entails reading a sentence and thinking about the subject and the grammatical complexity. And if I get where they're going with sentence one, I'll continue. And if I'm stuck or confused, I'll cut bait and assume that the whole passage will be difficult. It's a really crude way of analyzing difficulty, but you don't have a lot of time to do it. So I also don't think that authors frequently switch from very simple styles to complex or vice versa. I think it's a good proxy. The other things that you can do, action plans that you can implement now if you don't have one, is when you're reading passages, you want to be looking for structure and main points, not details. Again, that goes back to my theory about working memory. You simply cannot, if you have a normal intellect, you cannot remember all the details from the passage. And therefore, what you have to do is create a strategy that accounts for the fact that you can't remember them. What is a better thing that you can remember? The 3 or 4 or 5 main points from each paragraph. So find them and then get the main point question correct, then go from there. That's my whole goal for the first 4 minutes of the section, is I'm going to get that one question and I'm not going to miss it. I'm going to find every main point and make sure the first question is a done deal. It's kind of like the list question, the solution question to the logic game. If you miss that one, you didn't get it at all. So I feel the same way about the main point question. If you miss the first question of the bunch, you're really sunk. I mean, you might get a few more right, but you really missed the point. All right, so you're not reading here for details. Your memory simply isn't up to the challenge of incorporating all those details. You'll have to go back and find them when the time is right, or if the time ever becomes right. And so as far as annotating, my strategy here is very similar to LR. I have my students highlight the main point or the conclusion of each paragraph. They're really main points, but I analogize it to logical reasoning, where you're looking for that one statement that encapsulates the main point or the underlying purpose of the entire paragraph. And once you found it, if you get good at that skill, you'll learn to rely on your annotation so that you're not constantly reading and rereading. You look back at the passage and you have a lot of confidence that the 4 things you have highlighted are in fact the main points, and that you can rely on that as you work through the questions.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add here is that there's another framework in which you can identify what the easy passage is. One of them is rhetorical style, as Keith said. The other one is to really look at the content. This is something that Keith said to me a couple weeks ago that resonated with me a lot. You know, there are things that we read easily because there are things that we're not just passionate about. There are things that we're expert in. So in my previous life, I was a musician. In Keith's previous life, he was a musician. He was also in studying medicine, as was I. And so there are certain subjects that when we read the passage, we read it fluently because all of the technical jargon, all of the details in there, they're not mysterious to us. We don't hitch on them as we read them. We read them fluently because we know what they mean. We know not just their context, but their subtext. We know all of the subtleties to that language. So if you know that natural science passages are a thing that you're good at because you've studied natural sciences, seek out the natural science passage first. If you've studied art history or you've studied, literary theory, and you're steeped in that information, go seek out those passages first. There will be one, I promise. Right? And there will be a natural sciences passage, and there will be a sociology passage. And so find the ones that you've historically done well at because they're things that you're not worried about the details in, and do those first. And then worry about the ones that you struggle with afterwards, because you're going to get 2 more chances at it anyway.
All right, so blind reviewing RC. I want you to don't look up the answers. And then I have my students not just repeat the questions here, but more like the logic game where you're sort of recreating the entire process without the time limit, of course, but you want to read the passage again, double check your conception of the main points. I also have a game I play with some of my students. I meant to add it to the slideshow and I forgot, Jake. I work with students, and when I started teaching courses years ago, I used to teach, summarize the main point, write it in the margin if you have to. And I thought to myself, sure, I'm going to teach this because they pay me to teach it, but I'm a good test taker. I don't need that. And the game that I would play with my students is every paragraph we have to write the main point in 7 words or fewer. That's what makes it challenging. We only get 7 words. And also at the end, we must paraphrase the language of the author. We can take the language verbatim initially, but then before we finalize this, we start changing the language to simplify or just to think of some synonyms. And so what happened was I played this game year after year with class after class, and guess what? I became such a better reader because I developed this ability to synthesize information and then to think about different ways to say it, to think about all the different words I could substitute for the author's language. And all of a sudden, a lot of the answer choices that used to seem kind of obscure were predictable. This game was really powerful, but you don't have time to do it on a time test. This is a game you play on blind review, 7 words or fewer. And then once you've got your 7 words, start looking for some synonyms so that you can change the language up. And I bet you'll start finding that you start making predictions or you start seeing connections between some of the answers that were tough to identify and now they're not so tough since you've thought about different ways of phrasing that same thing. And
it's interesting, Keith, because I actually do advocate for paraphrasing in a time section.
And writing it out?
Not writing it out. Well, I do it internally, but for those of you who frequent Reddit, which I do daily because it's part of the fabric of our lives, there's a subreddit called Explain Like I'm 5. And the idea is that you've got something highly technical and highly complicated, like quantum mechanics, like, who knows what. And you say, explain like I'm 5. How does quantum mechanics mean that space-time does the following thing? And the objective of the subreddit is to boil this down to an explanation that's simple enough that you can demonstrate it to a 5-year-old. The other day, I had my 7-year-old at the table with me while I was going over an LSAT section in preparation for a student. And she sidled up to the table and said, "What are you doing?" And I walked her through this logic game. But she reads beautifully, but this is complex language. So I took the language. She would say, "Well, what does that mean?" And so I would distill it for her. And she's like, "Oh, okay. Well, that means this." And suddenly she was able to do the logic game, provided that I acted as the translation conduit. So for reading comp, what's super critical is that at every step, if we're trying to compare the complex rhetoric of the question stem with the complex rhetoric of the passage, with the complex rhetoric of the answer choices, we're having to translate at every step. But if we translate first and say, okay, well, here's this question. What does that mean? It means, why did he write it? Okay, fine. Let me go to the passage. Why did he write it? Well, I read. I find it. Oh, and here's the sentence before that justifies why he wrote it. Okay, now I'm going to say it for myself again in my own words. He wrote it because blah, 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 blah. Okay, fine. Now I'm going to go to the answer choice and look for he wrote it because blah, blah, blah. And that's all up here. And then if you're not doing it well in the time section, absolutely, you write it out on blind review. But it is the way to pierce reading comprehension. If you're struggling because the language is all complicated and jargony and weird and literary reviews and art theorists, right? That's hard. I don't know anything about art theory, but if I can find context for it for myself that makes sense and have my own words be attached to it, well, then I've stripped out all of the details that don't make sense to me, and then I can just get at the structure, which is what did it say? And then I know. Anyway, there's my story.
All right, well, we're getting close to the end here. I know we've run over time a little bit. So the strategy review for RC. I kind of have a blended strategy review here. I mean, I really try to be efficient. I don't want to waste my students' time and make them do work just for the sake of work. But on logic games, I truly believe that 3 reviews through every game is meaningful. In fact, 7 Sage's foolproof method says 10 times through every game. So mine's mild by comparison. But I think 3 is a good number to if you do it slowly and carefully. Now, for RC, what I like to do is have students sort of evaluate. Did you just miss 1 or 2 questions on that passage? If that's the case, then I think it's fine to kind of focus on those questions, sort of how we do on LR. You're just thinking about, how do I justify the right answer? How do I explain why the mistake that I made or the illogic in the incorrect answer? And then if you really want to go that step further, how do I convert the incorrect answer into a correct one? Although that's even trickier for RC. I still like to do the exercise. So that's one way to handle it if you've only missed a couple on the passage. But if you missed a bunch of them, particularly the main point question, then I think it's worth an approach more similar to logic games, where you're just starting over and saying, I botched it. I've botched it twice now, or maybe I didn't get to it and then I botched it on the blind review. So I'm going to take another stab at it, read the passage again, reanalyze the main points. You're taking advantage of the spaced repetition to start to learn that vocabulary. You're also learning how to deal with discomfort, which is a big part of the process that I endorse. Is I ask my students this all the time: what are you going to do when you don't know what to do? And I want them to tell me something specific. I've taught them different things. If they don't have a good answer to that, I'm annoyed, right? When they say I'm stuck and I say, well, what are you going to do when you don't know what to do? We have a plan for each section. And so we always fall back on that. On games, my plan is when I don't know what to do, I list out all the remaining elements. No matter where I am, where I'm stuck on that solution, that's what I do. I have to do something, and that's my plan. What do you do when you don't know what to do? Okay, so also the strategy review, I think consulting the resources, that's a good time to do it. But as we move through this presentation, the sources get more and more scarce. There's a lot for logic games, there's less for LR, and there's even less for RC. And so here's where I think a good tutor is almost essential if you're struggling in RC. I don't know where else you can turn for some of the more nuanced ideas about how to approach the section. And certainly if it's hard to rationalize the correct and incorrect answers, it's going to be even harder to come up with your action plan. And so it turns out, you know, I thought many years ago that I would talk myself out of a job. It turns out that this third review that I've come up with is so difficult that a good teacher really is helpful. But you need a good teacher, and you need one that's patient enough to allow you to go through the first few steps of the learning phase without him, so that he or she can come in and do the harder work of thinking about what now that you've made the mistake, now that you've learned the lesson, how do we fix your approach to the next time test? All right, go ahead, Jake. I think this is our last slide.
Sure. Well, so, you know, just to add one more thing on here, you know, I think it's critical that we think about reading comprehension as something fundamentally different from reading a book or from writing a paper about something you've read in a class. We've all been reading our whole lives. A lot of us reading in English our whole lives. Some of us it's second language or third language, and for you guys, I know that this is all the more difficult. But they call it reading comprehension for a reason. And so a lot of the resources will talk about the answer choices in the abstract, and if they're talking about it in the abstract, they are not good resources for reading comprehension. This section is about what is on the page, and if your resource isn't explaining it to you in terms of actual language from the actual passage and why they can either cite the exact language that justifies the answer, or they cite an inference that's made that's a very, very straightforward inference or assumption in order to justify the answer. If they're not explaining that, it's a bad resource. That is really the objective in this strategy review, is that you have to go back into the passage and say, I was supposed to comprehend the language. That's what it's called. From a test construction standpoint, when you write a test, you can't justify the answer if what you're asking the person to do is analyze something, because there are infinite analyses. But there's only one right answer as to what's on the page. Right? So what they're asking you for is what is on the page. If that's your framework, then when you look at strategy review, the answer almost universally is, I need to be stricter with myself about what is on the page and what is not on the page. And you have to start there. So that action plan really has to be about keeping yourself on track as to what is this section actually asking me to do. LR is asking me to complete a valid argument. Logic games is asking me to come up with deductions based on rules, and reading comprehension is asking me to read a thing and know what it's saying. And that's all.
Yeah, when he says stricter to what's on the page, what I find interesting about that is, what's the skill that enables you to remain more true to what's on the page? Paraphrasing. Yeah. That's what we've been talking about for 10 minutes, is that you have to get really good at saying the same thing a bunch of different ways, because that's what's ultimately going to determine whether the answer choices are justified by the text or not. Are they saying the same thing? Is that a paraphrase of what is, what the author said? And so that skill and that game that I talked about, thinking I was too smart to play, and then looking back and thinking about how much better I got at paraphrasing, it's taught me a lot of lessons about fundamentals and the importance of always starting there on any intellectual endeavor. We have one more slide. Let's do that last one and wrap it up, Jake.
Sure.
All right, so what do you do after you've done everything? You do it all again, except that each time you get better and better. So when you start your next section, after you've done one of each section types and you've gotten through an entire prep test, now you sit down again and you're doing another logic game section, another LR section, or another RC section. Step one should be you pull out your action plan. That's why I call it a work product, because if it's in your head, it doesn't exist. It has to be on the page. You pull it back out. This might be 4 or 5 days later, a week later, after you took the last logic game section. You're not going to remember your action plan, but you pull it out. And if you have these points bulleted, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, you read it, and then you take your next time test. And the thing that you have to do on the next time test is you must implement the action plan. If it fails, fine, then you develop a new action plan. But if you don't try it, you don't actually know if it was better or not, or whether you're even capable of executing it. So it's essential that you choose things that are concrete and actionable that you can actually do. And then it's also just as important that you do them. That's why I limit my students to just 2 or 3, because if it's 10, if it's the entire Power Score Bible, forget it.
Yeah.
You can't remember all that.
There's one more piece to it, which I think is really, really important. People talk a lot about keeping a wrong answer journal. And look, this kind of is your wrong answer journal. We have that trail of receipts about what we got right and what we got wrong. And that's a bit about what we're doing here. But I think the thing that's actually of value is an action plan journal. That what you really need to be doing is keeping track of what your action plans have been over the course of time. And you should be able to look back once a week, once every 2 weeks. What have my action plans been on logical reasoning? Do I see any patterns here? Right? Because then as you approach actual test day, you should be weaving all of those action plans into a grand master plan. And there should be a master plan, right? There should be the document that you go back to every day, the week. People always say, like, what do I do the week before the test? Should I be studying? Should I do 8 practice tests? Should I, 10 hours a day? What am I supposed to do? And I say, no, this is the time that you have to step back and say, I've trained for my marathon. I've done my 12-mile days and my 15-mile days, and I'm in the best shape of my life, and I've been eating really well. And, and I know that I can do it. Now is the time to focus your mind and get your mental preparation there. And yes, you should be running a little bit, but the other thing you should be doing is really thinking about the psychological approach. And there is a very important psychological component here. And that is, what is my master plan? What am I going to be doing the day before, the morning of? What should I be thinking about? What should my mind be steeped in? And it should be all of this positivity, all of this actionable stuff that you've been working on for months, but without it keeping a record of all of the things you've tried and the things that worked and the things that didn't work. Man, that idea about LR, that one time when I said over and over again, I'm going to think about this, and look how well I did that time, right? That's got to be part of my action plan every week. And so you incorporate it into your action plan every week, and you keep a master plan document, and you can start bringing stuff in from my daily action plan into my master document. Like, this is the home run here.
Let me riff on that for a second, because I think this action plan is the hardest thing for me to explain until I start doing it with students. But I want to give one example before we wrap this up. One very common problem that I see for students on LR is that they frequently don't diagnose causal reasoning correctly. They don't even recognize that it's a causal argument. And so what I tell my students, once I've noticed this once or twice, that there's been causal flaw, causal reasoning, and they've sort of whiffed it. What I do is I tell them, we're not just going to ask you to recognize causal reasoning better or hope that you spot it into the future. What we are now going to do is incorporate a step into your plan. The plan now is you're going to highlight the conclusion, and then ask yourself if that is a causal statement, right? So it created this positive action plan that includes, now it's not just about highlighting conclusions, it's about highlighting conclusions and asking a very specific question. Is this causal, yes or no? And then you move on with the rest of your plan. And what we do then is we say, okay, we put this action plan into place, 2, 3, 5 prep tests, I don't know how many, but at some point, the student stops coming to me with causal reasoning questions, and then we just remove it. We say, you know what? You've learned the skill of identifying causal conclusions. You no longer need to stop and make that a separate part of your plan. And so Jake was talking about, what is the master plan? It's not a compilation of every action plan that you've ever come up with. It's a synthesis of those where you've taken the most helpful ones, created even better action plans, and then you've taken the ones that you've utilized the usefulness of, and you start to wean yourself off of those. So it's an evolving action plan. And what I like about this is that it is tailored to you no matter what you're scoring. I can take this exact same approach with someone scoring 130 and 170, and I don't teach them anything different except that you have fewer questions to review if you're the 170 score. You can do it a little faster. But I honestly don't advise those two students in any different way. And so that's the entire spectrum of test takers. I have them do the exact same thing, time test, blind review, come up with a new strategy, do it again. Yeah. And they learn a lot. I love this plan.
Yeah, and you know, just to reinforce that bit, right? The difference between the 135 and the 165 is not what you're doing, it's how long you take to do it. And that has everything to do with what Keith said a couple of weeks ago that I loved, which was when a student comes and says, man, I got 10 wrong on that section, that's the wrong way to think about it. That's the negative lens. You put the positive lens on it. I've got 10 questions to learn from today. So if you're the 135 student, it's not that you're getting 20 wrong in every section. It's that you just have 20 things to learn from that section, whereas the 170 may only have 2 or 3 things to learn. And it takes longer to learn 20 things than 3 things. So you shouldn't be doing the triple review in a day and a half. It should take you 3 days, maybe 4 days. And that's okay. That's okay, because there's more to learn from that test. Don't jump on to the next thing without giving yourself an opportunity to learn as much as you can from the one you've already got. Your diagnostic exam is the one you should spend the longest on, because it's the one that you have the most to learn from.
Yeah, agreed.
So I believe that is the end of our slide presentation.
Yeah, that's, if you guys have to go, you're certainly welcome to log off, but we're going to stick around and take questions. And we've got some bios on here. I suggest we skip them, Jake. They know who we are.
People know who we are. So if you do have questions, feel free to stick them in the chat room, and I'll pop up the chat bubble here, and I will kill our screen share here. Feel free to chat them in the chat room, or if you want to raise your hand in the little function here, or unmute yourself and ask, please go ahead, ask anything about triple review, about us, about where you are and how this applies.
We forgot to advertise all our stuff.
Yeah, well,
ask a few questions first.
Sure. So if anybody's got questions,
jump in. I'm going to advertise if you guys.
So Vanessa said, how can we concretize the action plan? You know, that's a great question. Concrete, and to me, where we start is specificity, right? In high school, we are taught when we're writing, you know, it's one thing to say, well, Romeo and Juliet is about love. Okay, fine. What does that really mean? Okay, well, Romeo and Juliet is about young, naive love and the dangers of whatever. Okay, fine. But we need specifics, right? So we're told to go into the text and grab evidence, right? So with regard to concretizing your action plan, it's not enough to say, I want to get better at LR, I want to go faster on my games. No, what are you going to do? So if you want to think about it rhetorically, think about the verb. What are you going to do to get faster at your games? I am going to read and begin writing my rules immediately. I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to think. I'm not going to sort of marinate in the world of the game for a little while to try to think about what. No, I'm going to immediately start writing rules down, and that will make you faster. So that's a concrete action rather than sort of this ephemeral, like, I'm going to get faster. Okay, well, how? How are you going to do that? What are you going to do? What's that verb?
You know what I found about this question? It's kind of funny. It doesn't matter, and you don't have to be right.
Yep.
So here's the thing. It's the same thing like with finding the main points on the, or finding deductions on a logic game, or finding the flaws on a argument. It's all the same thing. And that is that sometimes you're going to be right, and sometimes you're going to be wrong. But the process of looking for those things is what's really leading to the growth, not just whether you're right or wrong in the conclusion. And so if you choose an action plan that isn't concrete enough to improve your performance on the next time section, you're going to figure that out really quick, because your next time section is not going to get any better.
Yep.
And you're going to, you miss the same kinds of questions, have the same kinds of issues, and you'll know, okay, I have to try something different. And eventually you'll find something that works, and that will be the concrete solution.
And it will be far more meaningful, right? This points us to a couple of things. My mom's a psychiatrist, so I've got all of this psychiatric jargon in my head from my childhood, but I came out okay. But one of the things that she really drilled down in me when I began teaching, she said, it's really important that you not tell people what to think or how to think it. Anybody who's ever been in therapy knows that a really good therapist just asks you really smart questions and lets you get there on your own. And the reason is that even though it may take a little longer, right? Even though it may take you 2, 3, 4 sessions, maybe it'll take you 6 months to discover that the anxiety you've got is really born out of the perfection that your mother demanded of you. If your therapist was the one that told you, you would reject it, you would run away from it, and you wouldn't learn anything. But if you ask open-ended questions, you let the person get there on their own. Once they get there, it's meaningful. The same is true for you. If you go to Power Score or you go to 7 Sage and you hear some explanation for a game and you're like, well, I guess that's how you do it, you haven't learned anything. What you need to do is get in there, get dirty, fail a bunch of times. That's why you do it 3 times. And even if you get to the strategy review and you can't do the game again in the strategy review, then you read 4. Don't read 1, read 2, so that you get contrasting ideas and you can come up with your own idea. But you have to get there yourself. It's why when I teach math, I don't give people the formula. I say, you want to know the distance between 2 points on a graph? You better figure out that you can draw a triangle. And once you figure out that you can draw a triangle that connects them, you already know Pythagoras' theorem, and then you can you can derive that formula on your own. You guys are supposed to be deriving these conclusions on your own, these ideas on your own in the LSAT. And so you have to get in there and fail a bunch. And that means coming up with concrete ideas and giving it your best chance at trying.
So I want to share something with the group, because I find that there's a lot of shame in LSAT prep. And I came to the LSAT from the MCAT world. I had taught MCAT for many years, and I was a professional teacher, a professional test taker before I ever set eyes on the LSAT. And from the day that I started prepping until I had the score and was ready to go apply to law school, that process took me 2 years. And I remember in that time, people saying to me, or people online implying or insinuating or me feeling that I felt very dumb for taking 2 years. And I would see people say, I did it in 3 months and I got a 180 and I got a 178 and I did this and I did that. And I remember looking back at the process afterward and reflecting and thinking, okay, so how did the chips fall? I had a 99th percentile score, went to law school for free, was on law review, and then got invited back to be a professor at my law school. So how dumb is that, to think that I was dumb? How can a test make you feel so dumb? You have to shed the shame of it and just say that you're going to use this as an educational tool so that you can learn a lot of good things and be really prepared when you do go to law school. And that's my pedagogy of test prep that Jake tells us they've already invented long before I came along. But that's my theory, is that you use this as your springboard to law school, not the hoop that they make you jump through.
Yeah.
It's a springboard, not a hoop. And it can be fun, it can be educational, and you can take as long as you need to do it. There is no clock, and I'm here to help you guys. Whatever you guys need, you know, call us and tell us what your budget is, call us and tell us what your scores are, what your goals are, and we will help you develop a plan to get there.
Yeah, yeah. Just looking at the chat, Esther, you said you notice that you do better at visualizing the stimulus than remembering words since it takes so long. Do you recommend not doing this or something else? I'm not sure what you mean by visualizing the stimulus. If you want to be a little more. Oh, here you are. You're unmuted. Yeah. What do you? What kind of stimulus are you talking about that you're visualizing?
So like when I read like a scientific stimulus or anything that's kind of like scary, I try to visualize like the main points, like I'll visualize like a little snail over a wave with like flames on it or something to kind of understand that this shell reacts to big waves and heat absorption. So I'll imagine something like that. And when I imagine stuff like that, like I feel like I really understand what is going on. But then the problem is that it's so time consuming. Like it could take me maybe 5 minutes to actually visualize everything.
I'm going to give you two answers. The first is, I think that's a brilliant way of paraphrasing, and you've come up with something really effective that works for you. And in that way, I think what you're doing is fantastic, because it's no different from the kind of paraphrasing that we're talking about. You're just using a different vocabulary. So in that way, I think it's great. If it's time consuming, and if it takes away, if what you're requiring of yourself is an understanding of the content of the passage rather than the structure of the passage, I don't mean this in a negative way, but you're likely wasting your time, right? You're likely trying too hard to understand what's going on instead of understanding that your objective is to answer the questions, right? We don't have to understand the science. It's nice if we do, but we actually don't need that. What we need to do is understand that we're supposed to know this is what they're talking about. They're talking about the structure of waves, or they're talking about, you know, composition of certain minerals, okay? And there are two scientists and they basically agree, and there's this other group that disagreed, but they were wrong. And then the author came up with a conclusion. And so given that, I'm out of focus now. Hopefully my camera will refocus me. That's weird. Given that, when we answer the questions, right, our job is not to understand the science. It's to say, okay, the question is asking me, what did the first scientist think of the second scientist's argument? And then I go back and find it. And if your visualization is used to serve answering the question, fantastic. But if you're doing it as you read in order to remember everything in the passage, you're expending a lot of energy getting to a point of understanding that you likely don't need. You're likely going too far. It would be impossible for me to know unless I watched you do it and we sort of talked through it once or twice. But that seems that if that's what you're talking about, if you're talking about on first pass, you're creating visual images for every idea in order to anchor all of your understanding, you're probably building too complex a house.
Thank you.
I'll say a quick word about this. Who asked that? I'm sorry.
Esther.
Esther. I think that this is a really smart and interesting strategy. These visuals, I've already let the cat out of the bag that I think visual tools and visual aids are super helpful and super important. But where I think they're most important is in the conceptual development. I would say that during the blind review, this is a great way for you to add a gloss on technical subjects so that you're now associating certain images with them. But I think that your action plan should be to come up with a strategy that doesn't require you to go through all of those steps. You use them to build your intuition so that your knowledge of that subject is now supplemented with the imagery you've come up with on the blind review, but it doesn't require you to come up with it on the fly. You have a different method for the timed section. And so speaking of that, I don't want to make this into a huge advertisement, but I do want to mention the stuff that we have coming up. I have an RC small group section on the 17th, and several spots open on that. They're $50 each, and I'm going to have 4 students in that section. I've got an LR section on Friday of this week, same time as the webinar, 1 spot or 2 on that 1 spot, I think, and then another LR one on the 14th. And so those are all opportunities to work with me for reduced cost because they're group environments. And then Jake and I have the class that we're running. It's a 4-week course, and it starts towards the end of this month. We're going to review 3 prep tests together. That class is $300, and it comes with access to all our webinars. So you did one today, but we have others that we're planning to host and record. So that's some of the opportunities to work with us coming up on RC.
Yeah, and in addition, you know, with that October course, one of the things that we're going to do, we're going to facilitate triple review for everybody. So I'm going to release a full calendar for the 4 weeks where, you know, here's the day that you're going to do your timed section. Here's the day you're going to do your blind review. And then we're all going to meet up for strategy review. And if you want to do your own strategy review first, I'm going to suggest it. Here are the sections we're doing in what order and on what days. The class is Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern. So that's when we're meeting in person. But in addition, what we're going to do, we're finishing up the class October 23rd in prep for the early November test, which leaves us 2 or 3 weeks of runway on the other side. And we're extending an offer to do 3 one-on-one hours with one of the 2 of us for an additional $300, which is a reduced rate for both of us as an add-on. And, you know, I mean, again, it's not about denigration of other people's products. You know, there are great products out there and great tutors out there and great classes out there. But for $600 to get 15 hours of time with me and Keith is pretty great. It's a really great deal, and I hope you guys take advantage of it. Yes, Esther, I will send out an email tomorrow with all these details and links to the Acuity schedule so that everybody can sign up if they want to. There was one other question I want to make sure we get to.
Let me jump in real quick, just to, because it's a segue from what you were saying. You talked about how these things are going to run, and I promised my students who are meeting with me on Friday that I would give them the assignment for Friday. And so I just want everyone to hear kind of how this will work. For Friday's group, what we're going to do is prep test 76. Section 2 in my book is the first LR section, but I know on Law Hub, they've done some weird things with the numbering. So it's the logical reasoning section that begins in the bodies of reptiles, right? That's the first argument. And what I want you guys to do before Friday is I want you to take that section timed, and I want you to put it aside for a little while. Then I want you to come back and blind review it. And then I want you to put it aside. And if you have time, come back and try that strategy review. And then let's meet on Friday. The other thing I want you guys to do is sometime on Thursday, send me a list of questions, 2 or 3 questions from that section that you just couldn't figure out. And what I'm going to do is prepare a lesson around those questions that's based on explaining those questions and giving you guys some strategies to attack what I see as the problems in the group. So that's how it's going to work on Friday, and I imagine our class will have a similar routine to it.
I think it was that no, Sandra asked, should you keep a chart of question types that you're struggling with? Yes, though I will say, as with all of these things, as you do more and more triple review, you are going to find that you're going to know which questions are the ones you're good at and which you aren't. I think keeping the chart is a good way to keep yourself accountable. And as part of your strategy review, I think it would be good. It's a very good sort of 40,000 feet look at LR in particular to be able to categorize the questions. And there are lots of frameworks to do that. I forget how many category types PowerScore has. It's something like 18. I don't remember. It's too many.
I say it's a dozen, but.
Yeah, and Ellen Cassidy would say there are 4. I sort of say there are 2, but there are subcategories within, because I think it's important to think of sort of 2 camps. There's arguments and there's everything else.
Right.
But look, whatever your framework is, it doesn't matter. you should be able to go through and question by question say, this is an argument flaw question. This is an argument weaken question. This is a parallel premises question. This is right. And you should be able to categorize all those. And then you can keep metadata on your right and wrong answers and say, look, here are all the arguments. And of the 13 arguments on this section, I got right twice. I got wrong 8 times, and I got wrong 5 times. So I'm doing okay with those, but every parallel premise question, I got wrong both times. So that's a problem.
Yeah.
And however you categorize it, that's up to you which framework works for you, and you can work that out with whatever your resource is. But you should definitely start doing that as a first look in strategy review. What kind of question is this? Did I get it right both times? Did I get it wrong right? Did I get it wrong?
I guess may I clarify?
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that. Okay. What I think I was trying, because I have been spending a lot of time learning the questions, you know, how to attack them. And I feel like I'm doing pretty well on those concepts. However, what I think what I was trying to get clarification on is, like, I want to start the blind review. And if I was to go through a chart and be able to put together my own sections to do blind review on those particular questions all at once. Does that make sense? Like for example, sufficient and necessary, or parallel, or whatever. And if I was to put them together and then at that time do the blind review on those, because I've noticed, although I have been doing this all wrong, I'm thankful for you guys, because, you know, this thing has been a crutch for me, going back and seeing the answers, and your methods I think are going to totally work for me. But I was just wondering if with some of the ones that I'm having difficulty with, if I were to just do them over and over again, or if I should just wait and just do the whole section, the PT. I don't know.
You should definitely do the whole section. I think there is merit to deconstructing the section and saying, I'm going to do every argument first.
Yeah.
Or I'm gonna take all the arguments in the section and I'm gonna put them in order. I'm gonna do the identify the conclusion or the premise question first, and then after that I'm going to go and do then I'll do the find the flaw questions, and then I'll do the assumption questions, and then I'll do, right, like I think there is merit to that. Whether I would advocate doing that every time, I think that's very personal. As to thinking about the way that you think. It's definitely a way to do strategy review. Definitely. In blind review, I'm waffling a little bit. I'm not certain that's a blind review technique, but for strategy review, absolutely. You should be categorizing, reorganizing. Here were all the necessary assumption questions, and I got 3 of them right, and I got 2 of them wrong. And what were the same and what was different? What made this one hard? What made this one easy? That's what you should be doing the third review. That's the time to learn that next level.
You know, one thing that I would recommend here too is what I have my students do is, if we do identify a question type that is persistently problematic, that's again where I think some of the resources are very valuable. So PowerScore, for example, has drills. And so you don't have to go create a prep test of strengthened questions. They've taken a bunch of old strengthened questions and compiled them into a drill in the strengthened question chapter of the Bible. And so some of those resources are out there, but what we have to do is we have to identify the problem first. What questions are you struggling with? Do you know the question type?
Sometimes the parallel questions, the method questions. And I'm also sort of embarrassed to tell you that sometimes I have a hard time identifying the main conclusion.
Don't be embarrassed. Those are very, very hard questions. Everybody has trouble with those. Don't ever be embarrassed.
Sometimes, you know, I mean, I just want to be, I mean, I feel like I just need this because, you know, I'm so lost right now. I feel like I'm in the wilderness with all these concepts, and I'm just trying to manipulate and put them together. And I went through a really expensive prep course way back last November at, you know, at USD here in San Diego. And you guys have taught me more in this time right here that I learned there, because it was awful. And they referred me to no offense to Khan Academy, but I could have used Khan Academy on my own, you know, but that was what they referred me to. But anyway, that's here and there. But I think what I'm seeing right now too is that there's 2 steps to this process. And I love your analogies with the sports, because, you know, it's like learning these concepts, then applying them. Mm-hmm. It's like reading a book on swimming, but
that's not
swimming. You know, I'm not until I get out there in the water and I save somebody, you know, I'm not really going to be able to. And I feel like this LSAT is a very arduous process. I mean, you have to learn all these concepts, and then you have to manipulate them in a very time, you know, and it's like running a mental marathon.
Yeah, I use marathon as the analogy all the time, but using your swimming analogy, it's really important to know also, and this is, you know, the managing expectations part of this, which will help your mindset. It really will. You have to know whether your objective here is to learn to swim, or whether your objective is to learn to swim well enough to become a lifeguard, or whether you're aiming for the Olympics. Right? If you're trying to swim the 100 in the Olympics, get a 179 and go to Yale, that's really different from learning how to do the crawl and the backstroke. And if you're, and that's not to say, and that's not to put a value judgment on it, right? It's not about value. If you want to be a Supreme Court clerk, you got to go to Yale, right? But if that's not your objective, if your objective is to, you know, do public service, and, you know, like, there are all sorts of other things that you can do where you don't need to go through the process of getting to 178. You need to go through the process to get to 150. And if that's your objective, know where your goalposts are, and then and work toward those goalposts. You don't have to master every question. To get a 150, you need to get half the questions right. That's it. So if you get really good at linear and grouping games, and you get really good at arguments, and just forget about parallel premises, maybe you'll get a couple of them right, maybe you won't, and who cares? I'm going to focus on my arguments for a while because I'm good at those, and I want to get those perfect, and then I'll lean into the things that I need to grow in. But I don't have to get every one of them right. I don't. I have to get a certain number of them right. And that's why the time sections are valuable. They let you know where you are on that progress toward your goalpost.
You know, I want to make a recommendation, Sandra. Next week, we have this circuit logic webinar. And I've mentioned that we've done these diagrams for logical reasoning, and we think that they're a very robust way to consider whether an argument is deductively valid. And what's more importantly about it is that if it's not, which most of them aren't, it gives you a strong analytical tool for figuring out where that flaw exists. And so the reason I mention this as a suggestion to your question is that you asked, you know, should I be treating these by question type? And one of the things that I really enjoyed about our circuit logic exercise that we did a few weeks back is that we made this diagram for an argument that was paired with a main point question. And so the answer to the question is quite simple. You find the main points, paraphrase it. You don't have to know anything about the logic of the argument or the flaw, but the diagram that we created is so robust that you could go back and start to ask yourself, what was the flaw of that argument? What was the assumption of that argument? How could I strengthen that argument? How could I weaken that argument? Are these assumptions necessary, or are they sufficient? And that's when I really started to get excited about this diagramming strategy, because it let me see things about the question that they didn't even ask me. I'm so high on this thing. I love this diagramming strategy. And the fact that we're getting to do it and people are paying us to show it to them, it just has me so stoked. But it's not a gimmick. I told Jake one time that it was a visual model of how I think about arguments. I think about them as this kind of trail, and you have to follow them in a certain logical order of steps, making certain connections. And we just put that in visual format so that you can sit back after you've done it and look at it and say, there's 3 potential points of flaw here. And you know, a lot of students come to me and they say, what if I can't find the flaw? Or what if I don't find all the flaws? This addresses that. I mean, I can never guarantee that you will find everything, but what I can say is that our images make it easy to think about each step of the logic independently and kind of isolate all of the flaws without just this sort of, onslaught of information. It's a way to organize it all. So I would really recommend that you come to that. And there's another question here that I want to address because we're running low on time, which is how long should you spend blind reviewing? I spend hours blind reviewing a section. I've spent 30 minutes to an hour on one game that I struggled with. I've spent 20 minutes thinking about an argument where I don't really get the language or the connections or why they think that conclusion flows from those premises. I mean, obviously it's flawed, but my first step is to figure out what the heck did they mean? Why did they think that was rational?
Yeah.
And so it takes me forever to blind review. It takes me hours to blind review a section, and I'm good at the LSAT.
Yeah.
Now the strategy review, for me, super simple. I miss very few questions, but the blind review is not a simple process. The better you are at arguments, the more you'll have to think about on blind review, the more like deeper you'll be able to unpack them.
And one of the things about blind review that I'll say for me, which should reinforce this too, I don't have to do sections timed anymore because I'm not prepping to actually take the thing timed. So I'm not timing myself anymore. But every time I have a student or a class that's doing a test, I will review that test again. And there are tests or sections on tests that I'll finish in 20 minutes because I remember it. I remember the questions, no problem, fine. Sometimes, man, I will sit and stare at a question for half an hour and be like, what is up with this question, right? Like, for years, I've been teaching for 20 years and I have a couple of students that stick out in my mind as the ones who really took me to task on questions that they thought were BS. And they said, this question is BS. I'm sorry. There's just something up with this question, the way they worded it, the thing they're trying to justify. And the task for me in my review of that section before I go back to a student with it is I need to be able to give them a better answer than this is the best among the bunch. It's not just about the best among the bunch. Yes, LSAC has made mistakes, and the prep test companies, the publishing companies make worse mistakes, right? If you go into Kaplan, or Keith will remember the company REA that used to make prep materials, REA books were filled with mistakes. But even LSAC, College Board, ETS, ACT, they make mistakes, and they have questions that are not great. They do. They're around. And every test or two, I'll come up with a question that I'll be like, guys, sorry, it's not a great question. I came across one in reading the other day in LSAT. I was like, this is not a highly justifiable question. It's certainly the right answer, but meh. But my job is to spend as long as I need to spend on that one question, really, really dissecting the rhetoric. What was the test maker really thinking? The person who wrote this question, how did they come up with this question, right? Where did they start so that they created a question around a type of flaw or around a kind of reading that they were trying to get you to do? Right?
Yeah.
And the only way I get to that level of meta-analysis is only possible because I've gone through these tests so many times, and I remember them. There's a game that for me, sticks in my head so much because it's a game that appears so simple. It's so simple and it's so hard because it's a linear game where everything occupies one spot except one of the objects, which can occupy two. And it's so hard because the rules are so hard to write down accurately. And it's so easy to make a mistake. And every time I do that game, I get one rule in and I say, oh, you did it again. And I have to rewrite my rules again. So blind review is an amazing place to learn about the game and learn about the ways they stretch their boundaries. So you really do want to spend as much time as you can on blind review, really getting as deep as you can. And look, if you hit a wall, you hit a wall. If you get diminishing returns, you get diminishing returns and you stop. I'm a huge advocate of self-care, and you don't want to harm yourself by trying to do this thing. But
no, I agree. Yeah.
Should we take one more and wrap it up?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ian, I saw that you unmuted yourself. You have a question?
Yes. I'm sorry. I missed part of what you said, Jake. Were you referring to me?
Yeah, I was. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Time. You mentioned maximizing the time between step 1 and step 2 being of value.
Yeah.
What about the time between steps 2, steps 3, and the wrap from a step 3 into the next section, next step 1?
It's hard and it's personal, right? Keith, what did you say 2 weeks ago? You said a day and a half or 2 days per section was a good pace for you.
What I usually have my students do, if they've got all day to study, I have them do time test in the morning, a few hours off, come back in the afternoon and start the blind review. It's rare that a beginning student can complete the blind review the same day. Maybe an advanced student could. So blind review is going to carry over to day 2 and you'll get a little sleep in before you finish the more challenging part of the section. And then, you know, I'd probably do another break and then start the strategy review. So yeah, it takes 2 to 3 days to blind review a section because I think that I use a lot of sports analogies too. And I think that there is a point where you are overtraining your brain and it simply cannot do what you're asking it to do. Or if it does, it's not the most efficient way to learn. So what you're really asking is what's the optimal time? And I think regardless of what's optimal, you also have to think about what's practical. I mean, if it was optimal to wait 2 days, would we have time to do that? I don't think so. I think the optimal time is you get right back to that same section while it's fresh in your mind, but you don't start it right when you end the exam. You know, you go decompress somehow and then work it back into your schedule to come back that same day and keep working the section.
Yeah.
It's fair to say that the time between 1 and 2 should be the longest, right? I mean, you can jump from 2 to 3 a little quicker and 3 back into 1 maybe, but
3 back into 1 for sure, because you should be doing a different kind of section. So that's easier to do. 2 to 3, look, you know, here's a meta action plan for you, right? As part of your action plan, you need to look back and say, was I really able to take a fresh look at the section given the amount of time that I spent? Was I really able to do that? If you were not, give yourself more time, or occupy your mind with something equally engaging, right? Go work out, go take a walk, go do something between those sections that that takes intellectual energy. Don't do something passive. Don't watch TV, don't mess around on Facebook, don't do more LSAT, right? That's not doing it service. You need to go, like I said, I'm an advocate of self-care, especially in these times. We are coping with hard things and we've all been cooped up inside for 6 months and it is really hard to focus well. So we really need to take the opportunity to give ourselves a fresh look. So if you look back and you say, look, this one worked really well. I gave myself an hour. I went out and took a run, had a cup of coffee and an apple, and I felt great going into my blind review. Great, do that again the next time, right? And if it wasn't, if you were like, look, I spent the whole blind review criticizing my thinking from my time section, you didn't give it long enough, or you weren't able to flush your brain well enough, right? I don't know if anybody's done any reading on dreams, but you know, the theory around dream right now is that dreams are meant as an opportunity for your brain to flush excess activity, and that we dream in order to reset ourselves for the next day, right? But if we're not giving our brain an opportunity to flush, we're just saturated with ideas and we give no chance for growth. So, and look, it also depends on where you are. Like he said, if you're a high scorer, if you're a 175 person, you're not going to have a very long blind review. And you're certainly not going to have a very long strategy review. So you can probably do it all in a day, right? If you're a 140 person, take 3 days, take 4 days, take a week if you have to. Let blind review take 2 days and learn everything you can. You're going to get way more out of it. Right? Spend half an hour on a question the way I do and really get as much out of it as you can. And take a big break, because guess what? It's taxing. So
sure.
You know, I think
of course.
I think if you really embrace the different purpose of the 3 reviews, I think it becomes less of a problem, the timing. And here's what I mean. So if I do a time section, and then because of my study schedule, I have planned to go ahead and blind review it immediately after I've taken it. It's not a huge problem for me, because as soon as I start my blind review, I commit to rethinking the questions without replicating the path I took on the time test. So for example, if I'm looking at a question and I see that on my time test I picked B, my thought process on the blind review is, who cares? I have no confidence that B is right. That was a 30-second, 1-minute decision. What I want to do is start over, unpack this problem again, and I really want to reflect more on the other answer choices, not the one I picked. I mean, ultimately, I'll have to think about B too, but what I want to think about is, what didn't I have time to think about that I wish I could have? What was I unsure of? What details do I wish I could have gone back and read again? So if you just embrace that this is something different, then, you know, in logic games, it's really easy to just go down the same logical path. But if you embrace that this is different and say, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to brute force it, change the strategy, do something different, try to learn more about this question in this game than I learned in the minute and a half that I figured out D was the right answer, then it's not the same process at all. It's the same question, but it's not the same process. And so I don't make too much of how much time to spend in between. I just want my students to do the 3 reviews. And I've never had a student commit to this and then for an extended period of time and then report back that they weren't significantly better. It's just like you've never met someone who goes to the gym every day and isn't really fit. Even if they're doing stupid stuff when they get down there. Right. Even if they're playing ball all day, if they go every single day, they're fit.
Yeah. I want to hit on one other thing about blind review, which I think is key. And, you know, Sandra, just because of the way you were talking about it, I'm going to put this in reference to you, but it applies to everybody. You know, Keith was saying, when it comes to strategy review, generally with ones that you got right and right, we can sort of move on. The games, we're going to do the whole thing, but with LR and RC, it's sort of not necessary. But if you're in a headspace at this point where you're feeling really frustrated, and you're really down and you're in this sort of vortex of negativity where you're like, man, I'm trying and trying and it's not happening, it's not happening, it's not happening. It's because you're so focused on the ones you're getting wrong. And I think one of the things you can do with strategy review, which can be both valuable and affirming, is go to the ones that you got right and spend, even if it's just 30 seconds or a minute, and just to say, hey, Sandra, look at you. You did this thing on the time section and you used this strategy and you got the right answer. And on blind review, you confirmed that right answer by going through all the wrong answers again. Good for you for applying that strategy the right way. You learned something and then move on, right? And think about how many times you get to do that on a strategy review. Think about how many questions you're answering, right? You're answering 75 questions if you're doing flex, 100 if you're doing the full test, right? I don't know where you're scoring right now, but let's say you're scoring a 150, right? You're getting 45, 50, 55 questions right. You get to tell yourself, good job, 55 times. And that's fantastic and that's powerful, right? It affirms that you're learning something, which is just as important as the learning of it. Because if you don't realize that you're learning it and you don't remind yourself that you're learning it, then you're doing yourself a disservice. This is that cram school thing that makes me so sick when I see it here. I'm in New York City, and there are cram schools all over the place where they send their 16-year-olds to spend 10-hour days learning the SAT for a year and a half. And think about the way these kids get beaten and beaten and beaten down thinking they're stupid, right? And we do it to ourselves as adults. We really do. We spend a lot of time giving ourselves a really hard time about the ways that we are less than, because we see other people who seem to be going through these things really easily, seem to be flying through it, but they're working really hard too. And maybe this is something that comes to them easily, but there are other things that are more difficult for them. Right. And so, but we're looking through such a narrow lens, we don't give ourselves an opportunity to remark not on how smart we are, but on how hard we worked and how much we accomplished. I don't know if you've got kids. I've got 2 kids. They're 7 and 4. Right. And the first lesson that modern parenting tells you is stop praising your kids for how smart and how beautiful they are and start praising them for their hard work. Right. We have to praise ourselves for our hard work. And you have to recognize when you've learned something, applied it successfully. So do take the opportunity on strategy review. Yes, it'll make it take a little longer, but do take the opportunity to recognize the things you've done well. I think it's going to be good for you.
You know, I want to say one follow-up to that, then we can end if you want to, Jake. I think one of the reasons why I advocate this kind of blind review, even though it takes forever and it's very tedious, you'll notice that 7 Sage and some others advocate a shortcut. They'll say, flag a few questions. You can come back and blind review those. One of the reasons that I want you to blind review every question, not just the hard ones, not just the ones you get wrong, but the ones you get right, is because there are lessons in those questions that you didn't take the time to learn because the answer was so easy to find.
Yeah.
The really easy question that you find the answer so simply, there are intricacies of those wrong answers that you can learn from. There are details of that argumentation, like I mentioned before, other questions that you can ask about the same argument that you can use to make that study process more robust. So, I think that this strategy is just dynamite, and I really have been enjoying teaching the triple review.
Yeah, for sure. So I think on that note, we'll say thank you. We really, really hope you guys come next week. Circuit logic is super fun, and we had an awesome time a couple weeks ago making all these slides, so they're worth seeing for sure. If you guys are interested in the group tutoring class in October, if you're not already signed up, I'll send you an email tomorrow with a link. You can check that out. If you're interested in a different model, if you'd rather do a small group course, if you can find 3 friends that want to split it with you or dangle that carrot out in the Facebook group, we'll certainly try to facilitate that. And if you'd like one-on-one time with us, obviously we're open to doing that. Just reach out and we'll steer you right.
One question before we go, and thank you for that.
Of course.
I start the LR on Monday,
Mm-hmm.
the class with Keith, right?
Yeah, we have our session Monday, right?
Yeah, so you were giving out some homework to the Friday. Does that also apply for Monday?
Let me reach out to you by message. I want to pick a test that
okay.
everybody has.
Okay,
And
okay.
it was just more vital for me to get Friday going because they only
No
have a couple
problem.
of
I'm
days.
sorry, I probably misspoke,
I
so
don't know.
No
I
worries.
apologize.
I'll reach out to you
Okay.
personally and we will sort that out.
thank you. I'm sure you guys are really tired, but thank you so much because it's probably pretty late where you guys are, so.
I love doing this stuff. I
Um,
appreciate everyone who showed up tonight. It is the only reason these things work.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. And
Thank
you'll
you.
get an email from me tomorrow.
Good
Thanks a
night.
lot.
Night,
Good
everybody.
night.